All right, here's our editor class with the content field. Now, to keep the screen clean, I didn't add the getter and the setter that we created in the last video. Now, the simplest way to solve this problem is by introducing a new field called previous content. So every time we want to change the value of the content field, we store the current value in the previous content field and then change the content field. That's a very simple solution and it works. However, with this approach, we can only undo once. If you want to be able to undo multiple times, we need a list. So we should rename this field to previous contents, note the plural name, and the type of this field is going to be a list. That's a reasonable solution. Now, what if sometime in the future, we introduce a new field like title? So our editor window is going to have a content and a title. Now, to support the undo mechanism, we need another field like previous titles to keep track of all the changes to the title field. Now, as you can see, this solution is not very extensible. Every time we introduce a new field, we need to add an extra field for storing all the changes to that field. So we need to come up with a better solution. Now, let me remove these two fields. Okay, that's better. So instead of having multiple fields in this class, we need a separate class like editor state. This class will be purely responsible for storing the state of our editor at a given time. Currently, we have only one field in this class called content. In the future, we can add title and other fields. All these fields are going to be in a single class, okay? So in our editor class, we need to store a list of editor states. So we need a composition relationship between these two classes. And that means we should rename this field from previous contents to previous states. So we have a list of editor states inside the editor class. Beautiful. Now, this is a better solution because it allows us to undo multiple times and we're not going to pollute the editor class with too many fields, okay? However, this solution is violating a very important principle in object-oriented design. That is the single responsibility principle. That basically means every class should have a single responsibility. Let me give you a metaphor. Think of a restaurant. In a restaurant, every person has a specific role. They do a single thing. The waiter is purely responsible for taking orders. They don't cook for you. Now imagine a restaurant where the waiter takes your order, he cooks for you, he goes shopping, he also does taxes. It doesn't make sense. A restaurant like that is going to be very unmanageable. We have the same situation in software. To build maintainable software, we should design our classes in such a way that they have a single responsibility. Now back to our design. Our editor class currently has two responsibilities. One of them is state management. The other is providing the features that we need from an editor. We need to take all the state management work outside of this class and put it somewhere else. So we shouldn't have this field inside this class, previous states. Let's delete this. That means we're not going to have an association with the editor state class. So delete, that's better. We need to introduce a new class called history. This class will have a single responsibility and that would be state management. So it will keep track of the changes in the state of the editor, okay? Now in this class, we need a field called states. This is the field that we previously had in our editor class, okay? So we have this field here, and that means we're going to have a composition relationship with the editor state. The history class is going to store 0 or more editor state objects in a list, okay? We also need two methods, push and pop. With push, we add a new state in the history, and with pop, we remove and return the last state. Now, technically, we could use a stack here instead of a list, but that's implementation detail. Let's not worry about it too much at this stage. Now that the editor class no longer stores state objects internally, we should give it two new methods, create state and restore state. The create state method stores the current state of the editor inside a state object and returns it. So we call this method and say, hey, save your current state and give it to me. We'll get an editor state object. Then we call the push method of the history class and say, hey, history, save this state. This is how these classes collaborate, okay? The restore method takes a state object and brings this editor back to that state. So it will reset its fields based on what we have in the state object. Now look at the type of relationship we have between the editor and the editor state classes. We have a dependency relationship. That means the editor class uses the editor state because the create state method returns an editor state object, okay? Well, congratulations. You came up with your first pattern. This is called the Memento pattern. We use the Memento pattern to implement undo mechanisms in our classes. Now here's our representation of the Memento pattern, but if you look at the Gang of Four book or any other courses or books on this topic, you will see different names for these classes. The editor is called the originator, the editor state is called the memento, and the history is called the caretaker. These are just some abstract names that Gang of Four came up with to demonstrate the concept. It doesn't mean you have to use them to name your classes. Always use meaningful names for your classes. So this is the Memento pattern. In this pattern, we have 3 participants or 3 players: originator, memento, and caretaker. Now that you understand this pattern, let's go ahead and implement it in code.